The year was 1952, and Catherine Thornton stood before the mouth of a cave that time had nearly forgotten. She was 28 years old, a school teacher with ink-stained fingers and a passion for local history that her colleagues found charming but impractical. In her hands, she held a leather journal so old that the binding had cracked and the pages had yellowed to the color of autumn leaves. Her grandfather, William Thornton, had given her this journal 3 weeks before he died. He had pressed it into her hands with fingers that trembled from age and urgency, and he had said words that still echoed in her mind. This is the story of your great-grandmother, the story of why our family still exists. You must tell it, Catherine. Do not let it be forgotten. Now she stood on this hillside in the Bitterroot Valley of Montana looking at what remained of a structure that had saved 3 lives 66 years ago. The sleeping platform was still visible beneath the debris and overgrowth. The curved wall near the entrance had crumbled, but its shape remained. A ventilation channel carved into the ceiling still led upward to the surface. Catherine opened the journal to the first page and read the words written there in careful, determined handwriting. Notes of Margaret Hartley Thornton, winter of 1886 to 1887, on the construction of the winter room. She turned to the next page and began to read. And as she read, the years fell away, and she found herself transported to a different time when a woman stood alone against the coming winter, armed with nothing but knowledge, determination, and a mother's love. The story began in September of 1886. The Bitterroot Valley lay between two mountain ranges, like a wound cut deep into the flesh of Montana territory. To the west rose the Bitterroot Range, with its jagged peaks crowned in eternal snow. To the east stood the Sapphire Mountains, lower but no less treacherous. Between these walls of stone, the Bitterroot River flowed lazily through meadows and forests, sustaining the scattered homesteads that clung to its banks. The settlement where Margaret Thornton lived consisted of perhaps 25 families spread across several miles. There was a trading post run by a man named Samuel Blackwood, a small wooden church presided over by Reverend Thomas Whitfield, and enough gossip to make any person's life the subject of endless discussion. Margaret, whom everyone called Maggie, had lived here for 13 years. But she had never truly belonged. She was too quiet, too thoughtful, too prone to saying things that others did not want to hear. People respected her because she worked hard and caused no trouble. But no one truly understood her. And now, with her husband vanished into the mountains, that difference had become even more pronounced. Maggie Thornton was 32 years old in the autumn of 1886. Her hair was chestnut brown with threads of silver appearing at her temples, and her gray-blue eyes held a distant quality as though she were always calculating something that others could not see. Her face was angular rather than soft, determined rather than pretty. It was the face of a woman who had learned to solve her own problems. Her hands were calloused from farm work, but they retained a dexterity that emerged when she mended clothing or sketched small diagrams in the notebook she always kept nearby. That notebook was a habit from her former life, from the years before she came to Montana, from a time she rarely spoke about. What few people in the valley knew was that Maggie had not been born to frontier life. She was the daughter of Professor William Hartley, a construction engineer at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology who had spent his career studying the thermal properties of natural materials. She had grown up surrounded by technical drawings and scientific discussions, learning about heat transfer coefficients and the insulating properties of stone, while other girls learned needlepoint and piano. Her father had died when she was 17. A construction site collapse that might have been an accident or might have been the result of cost-cutting by men who valued profit over safety. After his death, her mother had remarried a man Maggie could not accept. At 19, she had fled Boston with a young dreamer named Robert Thornton, who promised her freedom and adventure in the American West. 13 years later, freedom had become struggle, adventure had become survival, and Robert had disappeared into the mountains without a trace. Robert Thornton had left on a July morning with a confident smile and a promise to return within 3 weeks. He was taking cattle down from the summer range, a routine job he had done many times before. 3 weeks became 4. 4 became 6. By mid-August, Samuel Blackwood had organized a search party. They followed Robert's route into the high country, asked at every ranch and way station along the path. No one had seen Robert Thornton after July 15th. He and his horse had simply vanished, swallowed by the wilderness, as so many others had been before. There was no body, No sign of accident or attack. No explanation. The mountains had taken him, and the mountains did not give back what they took. 2 weeks after the search party abandoned hope, Maggie found something hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the corner of their cabin. It was in the spot where Robert always sat when he was thinking about his plans, his schemes, his dreams of something better. Under the floorboard was a small leather notebook. Maggie opened it with trembling hands, and her heart stopped when she recognized her husband's handwriting. Messy, barely legible, just as it had always been. But the contents made her sit down heavily on the rough wooden chair and read the pages 3 times to be certain she understood. Robert had discovered a limestone cave a few hundred yards from their cabin during a hunting trip the previous spring. He had entered it multiple times, measuring, observing, even bringing a thermometer to record temperatures on different days. The final pages of the notebook contained these words. July 5, 1886. The cave maintains stable temperature. 52 degrees on the hottest day, 50 degrees on the coldest day I measured. Limestone is an excellent natural insulator. If this winter becomes too severe, the cave might serve as shelter. I must tell Maggie about this when I return. She will understand. She always understands things about science better than I do. Perhaps she can figure out how to make it truly useful. I hope this winter will be mild. But if it is not, the cave might save their lives. Maggie sat in the darkness of her cabin, the notebook in her hands, and wept. Not only for the loss of her husband, but for the realization that Robert, despite all of his impractical dreams and broken promises, had been thinking of her and their children even before he left, and he had given her a clue. Perhaps the clue that would save them all. Their children, William and Emma, Billy and Emma. Billy was 8 years old, a quiet boy who carried burdens too heavy for his small shoulders. He had his mother's dark hair and his father's warm brown eyes, and a seriousness that seemed out of place in a child so young. Since his father's disappearance, Billy had appointed himself the man of the house. He rose early to help his mother carry water. He watched his little sister when his mother was busy. He tried to hide his tears at night, not wanting to add to his mother's worries. But Billy had a problem he could not hide. A cough that had begun in spring as a minor irritation had grown steadily worse through summer and into fall. Now in September, it had become a wet, rattling sound that seemed to come from deep within his chest, as though something were loosening inside him. Dr. Harrison Wells, the only physician within 50 miles, had examined Billy twice. The first time he prescribed ordinary cough medicine. The second time, after listening to the boy's lungs through his stethoscope, his face had grown grave. Mrs. Thornton, he said privately to Maggie after the examination, I will be direct with you. The boy's lungs are weak. This cough, if he is exposed to severe cold this winter, if the temperature in your home drops too low, there is a real risk it will develop into pneumonia. And if it becomes pneumonia, Maggie asked, though she already knew the answer. Dr. Wells did not meet her eyes. You must keep him warm throughout the winter. That is the most important thing. Keep Billy warm throughout the winter, in a cabin where frost formed on the inside of the door, even when the fire roared at full strength. Maggie said nothing. She simply nodded and showed the doctor out. Emma was 5 years old, the sunshine of the Thornton family. She had golden hair, bright blue eyes, and a smile that could warm the coldest heart. She did not fully understand what was happening. She only knew that her father had gone away for work and would return just as he always had before. When will Papa come home? She asked every evening before bed. Soon, sweetheart, Maggie always answered, though each lie cut her like a blade. Emma had a rag doll named Daisy that Robert had made for her before he left. The doll had yellow yarn hair and blue button eyes, and Emma carried it everywhere, sharing secrets with it that she told no one else. One night in early October, after the children had fallen asleep, Maggie lit a lantern and walked through her cabin with eyes she had deliberately not used for 13 years. The eyes of an engineer's daughter. The eyes of someone trained to see what others overlooked. What she saw was not a home. It was a death sentence. The walls. Robert had built the cabin in a single summer, rushed and impatient as always. The walls were only 6 inches of pine logs with no insulation, no air gap for thermal protection. Pine conducted heat relatively well compared to other woods, which meant warmth escaped faster than it should. Worse, there were gaps between the logs, some wide enough to slip a finger through. Robert had filled these gaps with clay, but the clay had dried and cracked over 2 winters, leaving holes that wind could whistle through. The floor. Packed earth with no wooden planks, no insulation layer. Soil was an efficient conductor of heat. It would draw warmth from anyone standing or sitting on it and transfer that warmth down into the frozen ground below. The fireplace. This was the greatest disaster of all. Robert had built the fireplace in the style he had seen in other homes. Wide-mouth straight chimney. The problem was that this design had extremely low thermal efficiency. Most of the heat from the fire went straight up the chimney and out into the cold air rather than radiating into the room. Maggie estimated the fireplace retained perhaps 10 to 15% of the heat it generated. The rest was wasted. Furthermore, the fireplace had no thermal mass, no thick brick walls to absorb heat and release it slowly. When the fire burned, the room was warm. When the fire died, the room grew cold almost immediately. The roof. Multiple gaps where wood had shrunk over time, where the sod covering had been washed away by rain. Heat rose and a leaky roof meant heat escaped constantly. Maggie sat down with a scrap of paper and a pencil tool she had kept from her Boston days and began to calculate. She used formulas her father had taught her, formulas she thought she had forgotten. After 2 hours of calculation, Maggie had a number. The cabin lost heat approximately 3 times faster than a properly constructed home would. That meant she needed to burn 3 times as much firewood to maintain the same temperature. She looked at the woodpile behind the cabin, perhaps 4 cords, with a normal cabin enough for the entire winter. With this cabin, maybe 2 months. 3 if she accepted dangerously low indoor temperatures. A Montana winter lasted 5 to 6 months. That night, around 2 in the morning, Maggie woke to the sound of Billy coughing. She lay still listening. The cough was wet, deep, prolonged. Then came the sound of Emma whimpering, awakened by her brother's distress. Maggie rose and added wood to the fireplace. The flames leaped up, but the warmth spread only a few feet before the cold swallowed it. She looked at the thermometer on the wall. 45 degrees Fahrenheit. Inside the cabin, with the fire burning, she looked at the children's bed. Billy was trying to suppress his cough, his face twisted with effort. Emma had curled into a ball like a kitten, seeking warmth from her brother's body. And Maggie realized a brutal truth. She could burn all the wood tonight, this week, this month. This cabin could never keep her children alive through winter. She needed another option. She needed the cave. The next morning, Maggie waited until the children had eaten breakfast. She gave Billy the task of watching his sister and told them she needed to check the rabbit traps behind the hill. Do not leave the house, she instructed. I will be back before noon. She took a bag containing an oil lamp, matches, and Robert's notebook. Following the directions in the notebook from the old oak tree northwest, 200 paces past the wild berry bushes, up the limestone hillside, she found the cave entrance. It was smaller than she had expected, only about 4 feet wide and 3 feet high at its tallest point. Without the notebook's directions, no one would notice it, just a crack in the gray limestone cliff hidden by brush and fallen rocks. Maggie lit the lamp and crawled inside. The first 10 feet were a narrow passage with a low ceiling, just enough space for an adult to move through on hands and knees. Then the cave opened suddenly, like stepping from a hallway into a room. Maggie stood upright and raised the lamp high. The ceiling rose to about 8 feet comfortable standing height. The walls were solid limestone, pale gray, with white veins, dry and smooth. The floor was covered with rock debris and decayed leaves, but beneath that layer was solid limestone bedrock. The cave extended perhaps 30 feet before ending in a natural stone wall. No other passages, no dangerous cracks, no signs of groundwater or animal habitation. Maggie placed her hand against the cave wall. Cool. Not cold, not damp, just cool. A pleasant, stable, safe coolness. She closed her eyes and remembered her father's voice from those distant evenings in Boston. Maggie, soil and stone are excellent natural insulators. The deeper underground you go, the more stable the temperature becomes. In summer, underground is cooler than the surface. In winter, underground is warmer than the surface. That is why ancient peoples lived in caves. Not because they did not know how to build houses, but because caves were more efficient. She opened her eyes and looked around the cave with new vision. Not the eyes of someone seeking shelter, but the eyes of an engineer assessing potential. This cave could become a winter room. Maggie sat down in the middle of the cave, letting the lamplight cast dancing shadows on the limestone walls, and began to form a plan in her mind. If she built a curved wall near the entrance to block cold air from flooding in, If she built a sleeping platform of stone raised above the cold floor. If she built a small firebox beneath the stone platform, heating the stone rather than the air. Stone held heat, slow to warm, slow to cool. If she could accumulate enough massive stone and provide a stable heat source, she could transform this cave into a thermal battery. Store heat when the fire burned, release heat when the fire died. Combined with the natural insulation of thousands of tons of rock and earth surrounding the cave. For the first time in months, Maggie felt a spark of hope. She did not know for certain it would work. She had no technical drawings, no instruction manual, no one to consult. But she had the knowledge her father had passed down. She had Robert's notebook with his initial observations, and she had the most powerful motivation in the world. 2 children waiting for her at home. Maggie stood, brushed the dust from her skirt, and made her decision. She would build the winter room, and she would tell no one until it was complete. Marcus Fletcher was 55 years old, the most respected carpenter and builder in the Bitterroot Valley. He had constructed more than half the homes in the settlement, and he was very proud of that fact. Perhaps too proud. Marcus was a man of rules and traditions. He had learned his trade from his father, who had learned from his father before him. Each generation passed down methods that had been tested by time. In Marcus's mind, there was a right way to build, and every other way was wrong. He was not a cruel man. He genuinely believed he was helping the community by maintaining standards. But that belief came with rigidity. If someone did things differently, Marcus saw it as an insult to his experience. There was another reason Marcus paid particular attention to the Thornton family. 6 months before Robert disappeared, Marcus had proposed a deal. He would repair the Thornton cabin, seal the gaps, add insulation, rebuild the fireplace properly in exchange for Robert's labor on the new church construction project. It was a fair arrangement, and Robert had agreed. Then Robert had taken a cattle-driving job that paid better. He promised to fulfill his agreement with Marcus when he returned. Robert never returned. Marcus did not blame Maggie directly, but every time he looked at that shabby cabin, he felt a simmering resentment. If Robert had kept his word, the cabin would be repaired. Now a widow and 2 children had to survive in that cold box of a house, and that was Robert's fault. And perhaps, in some indirect way, Maggie's fault for not convincing her husband to do the right thing. When Marcus heard that Maggie was digging a cave on the hillside like some kind of bear, his reaction was a mixture of genuine concern and bitter satisfaction. This is what happens when people do not follow the proper way he thought. They start doing crazy things. On the last day of the first week of her work, Marcus Fletcher happened to ride past the hillside on his way home from a job site. He saw Maggie coming down from the direction of the cave, her clothes covered in dust, her face streaked with sweat despite the cooling weather. "Mrs. Thornton," he called, stopping his horse. "What are you doing up there?" Maggie stopped and looked at him with an expressionless gaze. "My own business, Mr. Fletcher. I am just asking, out of concern. A widow with 2 small children should not be wandering alone on wild hillsides. Thank you for your concern." Maggie continued walking without looking back. Marcus sat on his horse watching her, his jaw tight with irritation. He was not accustomed to being dismissed so curtly. That evening, curiosity overcame him. Marcus climbed the hillside, found the cave entrance, and peered inside with his oil lamp. He saw the cleared floor, the footprints in the must and tools hidden in a corner. "Good Lord," he muttered. "She is actually planning to live in there." Marcus could not keep quiet. That night at Blackwood's trading post, he told everyone what he had seen. "Mrs. Thornton is digging out a cave up on the hill. I saw it with my own eyes. She has cleared the floor, prepared tools. It looks like she intends to live in it." The reaction was a mixture of surprise and mockery. "Living in a cave like a prehistoric savage?" Samuel Blackwood asked, shaking his head. "Poor thing. Losing her husband has made her lose her mind," said Mrs. Patterson, the shopkeeper's wife, with false sympathy. "Perhaps we should intervene," someone suggested. "We cannot allow 2 children to live with a mother who has gone mad." "She is not mad." Everyone turned to look at the man who had spoken. It was Thomas Garrett, the quiet newcomer who had arrived a few months earlier, the man who rarely said anything. Thomas Garrett was 42 years old, tall and lean, with salt and pepper hair and gray eyes that held a sadness as though he had seen too much that he wished he could forget. He had come to Montana from Pennsylvania after his wife Martha died of tuberculosis, leaving behind 3 grown children, and a farm full of memories he could no longer bear. "What do you know about her?" Marcus challenged. "I know nothing about her," Thomas admitted, "but I know the difference between madness and desperation. They are not the same thing." Silence fell over the trading post. Thomas stood, left money on the counter for his drink, and walked out without another word. Marcus watched him go, his lips pressed tight. He did not like being contradicted, especially by a newcomer who understood nothing about this valley. The story of the widow Thornton's bear den became the subject of gossip for weeks. The community divided into two camps. The majority considered it a sign of grief-induced insanity. They pitied Maggie, worried about the children, and believed someone should intervene. The minority simply watched and waited. Helen Morrison, the kindly widow who lived 2 miles south, belonged to this group. So did Thomas Garrett. They did not say Maggie was right, and they simply were not certain she was wrong. And alone, separate from both camps, Maggie continued her work, indifferent to what others thought. A week after the gossip began spreading, Marcus Fletcher came to Maggie's cabin under the pretense of checking if she needed anything. But his true purpose was to tell her what he thought. "Mrs. Thornton," he began, after being invited in and refusing coffee, "I think we need to speak plainly about that project of yours on the hillside." Maggie stood by the fireplace, arms crossed over her chest. "What do you wish to say? I am a builder. I have been building homes for 30 years. And I can tell you that living in a cave is the worst idea I have ever heard." Why? The simple question caught Marcus off guard for a moment. He had expected her to be defensive, to make excuse, perhaps to cry. He had not expected a calm question. Why? Because stone is cold. Because caves are damp. Because that is how primitive people lived, and we have progressed beyond that. Stone holds heat. Maggie replied, her voice level, as though lecturing a student. If heated properly, stone radiates warmth for hours after the heat source is removed. And my cave is not damp. I have checked. The limestone is dry. There is no groundwater. Marcus opened his mouth and closed it again. He had never thought about stone that way. As for primitive people, Maggie continued, the Russians and Finns have used masonry heaters for hundreds of years. They are not primitive. They are practical people living in places far colder than Montana. Marcus felt blood rushing to his face. He was not accustomed to being lectured by a woman, a widow, about construction. "You think you know more than I do. A man who has built homes his entire life." "I am not saying I know more than you." Maggie remained calm, but her eyes grew cold. "I am saying you do not know everything. And in this case, I believe I am right." "You believe you are right," Marcus laughed scornfully. "Based on what? Are you a builder? Are you an engineer?" Silence. "Oh." Then Maggie spoke, her voice trembling slightly. "My father was an engineer, Professor William Hartley, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. He studied the thermal properties of materials for 20 years. And he taught me." Marcus fell silent. He had not expected this. "Your father, Professor Hartley," he repeated, not sure he had heard correctly. "Yes, you may not believe me. You may think I am insane, but I will continue building my winter room, and when winter comes, we will see who is right." Maggie opened the door. "Now, if you have no other business, I have work to do." Marcus stepped outside, his face flushed red. He wanted to say something, a warning, a threat, anything to regain the upper hand, but he could find no words. The door closed behind him. Late October. The work in the cave had progressed significantly. The curved baffle wall near the entrance was half complete. The cave floor had been leveled. The positions of the sleeping platform and firebox had been marked. But Maggie knew she was racing against time. The old-timers in the valley were speaking about the coming winter in voices she had never heard before. Voices filled with worry, like 66 Old Man Henderson said at the trading post. "I remember that feeling in my bones. This winter is going to be a killer." That night, Maggie sat beside the bed where her children slept, looking out the window. A full moon illuminated the valley, and for the first time she saw a thin layer of frost coating the grass. The first frost, 2 weeks earlier than usual. She looked at Billy. Even in sleep, his face was pinched. His breathing labored. She looked at Emma, curled up tight, clutching her doll Daisy. "I will keep you safe," Maggie whispered. "I promise, Mom." The next morning, a flock of geese flew south. Hundreds of them, thousands of them, flying in V formation across the gray sky. They honked loudly as though warning anyone still below. Maggie stood in the yard looking up. Geese were never wrong. They knew when it was time to leave. She looked toward the hillside where the unfinished cave waited. How much time did she have? 4 weeks, three, less not enough. Never enough. But she had to try. Maggie went back inside, gathered her tools, and headed up the hill. Her steps were faster than usual, as though every minute were precious. Because every minute was precious. November arrived with teeth. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in a single week, and the wind that swept down from the northern mountains carried a bite that made exposed skin ache within minutes. The grass in the valley turned brown and brittle, crunching underfoot like shattered glass. Ice formed along the edges of the creek each morning, thin and delicate at first, then thicker as the days grew shorter. Maggie worked as though her life depended on it, because it did. Each day began before dawn. She rose in darkness, lit the fire in the cabin's inefficient fireplace, and prepared breakfast for the children. By the time the first gray light of morning appeared over the Sapphire Mountains, she was already climbing the hillside with her bag of tools heavy on her shoulder. Now it was time to turn her mental designs into reality. The baffle wall came first. This curved barrier near the cave entrance was the most critical element of the entire system. Cold air was heavier than warm air. It sank and flowed like water. Without a barrier, cold air from outside would flood into the cave every time the entrance was opened, pushing warm air out and causing the temperature to plunge. Maggie designed the baffle wall based on a principle her father had called the air trap. The wall would be positioned 4 feet inside the cave mouth, rising 5 feet high, with a 2-foot gap at the top for ventilation. Its shape would curve like the letter C, opening toward the interior of the cave. The principle was simple but effective. When cold air entered from outside, it would strike the curved wall and be trapped in the area near the entrance. Warm air inside, being lighter, would rise and circulate through the gap above. The result would be a pocket of cold air at the entry and warm air preserved deep within. She gathered flat stones from the creek bed half a mile away. Sandstone, mostly because it split cleanly and stacked well. Each stone weighed between 20 and 30 pounds, just light enough for her to carry, but heavy enough to be stable when placed. Every day she made the journey 15 to 20 times. Down the hillside, along the path to the creek, select the right stones, load them into the canvas sling, carry them back up. Her shoulders turned purple with bruises. Her hands cracked and bled through the calluses. But she did not stop. She used no mortar. She had none, and she did not need it. Instead, she employed the technique her father had described as friction fit. She selected stones with flat surfaces, stacked them so the weight of each stone pressed down on the one below, and used smaller rocks as shims to fill any gaps. Gravity is the best mason, her father had once said. If you stack stones correctly, gravity will hold them in place forever. After 10 days, the baffle wall was complete. Maggie stepped back and examined her work. The curved wall stood solid and stable, each stone fitted against its neighbor like pieces of a puzzle. When she walked past it into the deeper part of the cave, she could already feel the difference. The air was stiller, calmer, more protected. The sleeping platform came next. This was the heart of the heating system. This was where thermal mass would be stored and released. Maggie designed the platform based on principles her father had studied in the heating systems of other cultures. The Chinese Kang, a heated bed platform. The Russian Pechka, a massive masonry stove. The Finnish contraflow fireplace. All of them operated on the same concept. Heat a large mass of material slowly. Let it release that heat slowly. Turn stone into a battery. The platform would be 3 feet wide and 6 feet long, enough space for her and both children to sleep. It would rise 18 inches above the cave floor, positioning them above the coldest layer of air. Beneath the platform would be a hollow space containing the firebox, where flames would heat the stone from below. She built from the bottom up. First came the foundation, a layer of flat stones placed directly on the cave floor, creating a stable base. Then the side walls, 2 rows of stacked stones rising 18 inches high. At one end, she constructed the firebox itself, a space 2 feet square with walls angled to reflect heat upward into the stone mass above. Running along the length of the platform was a narrow channel through which hot smoke would pass before escaping through the ventilation cracks she had widened in the ceiling. The physics were straightforward but demanded precision. Heat from the fire would rise into the stone platform. The stone would absorb this heat, slowly storing it within its mass. When the fire died, the stone would release that stored heat gradually over many hours, radiating warmth into the cave air and into the bodies of anyone lying on the platform. The firebox required the most careful work. She lined it with firestones she had collected from old campfire rings, rocks that had already proven their ability to withstand high temperatures without cracking. She angled the back wall at precisely the right degree to reflect heat upward, rather than letting it dissipate in all directions. She left a narrow opening at the front for airflow, ensuring the fire would have enough oxygen to burn efficiently. Around the firebox, she packed clay. Thick clay from the creek bank mixed with dried grass for binding, applied in layers and allowed to dry between each application. Clay was an excellent insulator. It would keep the heat concentrated where she wanted it, rather than letting it escape in unwanted directions. When the platform was complete, Maggie estimated its total mass, approximately 1,200 pounds of stone and clay, 1,200 pounds of material capable of absorbing, storing, and radiating heat. This was her thermal battery. She lined the top of the platform with thin wooden slats for insulation between sleepers and stone. Over this, she laid an old wool blanket. On top of the blanket, she spread a bearskin that a trapper had traded her for bread 2 summers earlier. Insulation below, insulation above, and a massive heat source radiating from beneath. The ventilation system was the final element. Smoke needed somewhere to go, or it would fill the cave and make the space uninhabitable. She had identified a natural crack in the cave ceiling that led upward through the fractured limestone to the surface. Using her chisel, she widened this crack until it could serve as a natural chimney. The physics would handle the rest. Hot smoke would rise, creating a draft that pulled fresh air in through the entrance and past the baffle wall. Thomas Garrett also began appearing at the Thornton homestead with increasing regularity during this time. He never announced his visits or offered explanations. He simply arrived with practical gifts: a haunch of venison from his hunting, help repairing a fence post that had rotted through, an extra axe he claimed he did not need. He asked about the cave project once after hearing Marcus Fletcher's complaints at the trading post. Maggie showed him the entrance but did not take him inside. She was not ready to share that much with anyone yet. Thomas nodded and said nothing more about it, but he began leaving small bundles of dry kindling near her woodpile, the kind of thin sticks that burned hot and fast. Exactly what she needed for the firebox. He never asked for thanks. He never asked for anything at all. By the last week of November, the winter room was nearly complete. Maggie stood in the center of her creation and looked around with something approaching wonder. 6 weeks of labor, hundreds of trips carrying stones, countless hours of stacking, fitting, adjusting. And now it was real. A shelter within a shelter. A warm heart hidden inside cold stone. She decided to test it. On a night when the temperature outside dropped to 25 degrees, she brought Billy and Emma up to the cave. She told them it was an adventure, a special camping trip to their secret winter room. Emma was delighted. "It is like a bear cave," she exclaimed. "We are bears hibernating for winter." Billy said nothing, but his eyes moved over the walls, the platform, the firebox. He understood more than his mother realized. Maggie built a small fire in the firebox, just small dry sticks kindling and bark, nothing large. She did not need a roaring blaze. She needed efficient heat transferred into stone. The fire burned for 2 hours. Then she let it die. She sat in the darkness of the cave, the oil lamp turned low, counting time with the small hourglass she had brought from Boston. 1 hour after the fire died, the platform remained warm beneath her hand. The air temperature held steady around 55 degrees. 2 hours, still warm. 3 hours, still warm. 4 hours, still warm. 5 hours. When the first faint light of dawn began filtering through the cave entrance, she checked the thermometer. 50 degrees inside the cave. Outside, the temperature had dropped below 20. The platform was still warm. No fire had burned for over 4 hours yet. The stone continued radiating heat into the space. Billy and Emma had slept soundly through the night, better than they had slept in weeks. When Billy woke, he did not cough once. Mama Emma said, stretching and yawning, "It is so warm. Like being hugged." Maggie smiled. For the first time in many weeks, she allowed herself to believe they might survive. But she could not keep her work secret forever. Helen Morrison, the kindly widow who had been Maggie's only true friend since Robert's disappearance, began to notice something strange. Maggie was gone for hours each day, returning with dust on her clothes and blood on her hands. Maggie Helen said during one visit, "Where do you go every day? You come back covered in dirt, your hands torn up. What are you doing?" Maggie looked at the older woman. Helen had never judged her, never pitied her with false sympathy, never offered useless advice. She had simply been present, reliable, kind. "I want to show you something," Maggie said. She led Helen up the hillside through the brush to the cave entrance. She lit a lamp and guided her friend inside past the balcony wall into the main chamber. Helen stood in the warm space, her mouth open, her eyes wide. "Good Lord," she whispered. She walked around the chamber, touching the walls, examining the firebox, running her hands over the sleeping platform. She was not an engineer, but she was a practical woman who had survived 30 years on the frontier. She recognized solid work when she saw it. "You built all this yourself?" "Yes." "How long?" "6 weeks." Helen turned to look at Maggie, really look at her as though seeing her for the first time. "This is not the work of a crazy woman," she said, her voice filled with respect. "This is the work of someone trying to survive." Maggie felt tears prick her eyes. "You do not think I am insane," Maggie, Helen said gently. 30 years ago, when George and I first came here, everyone thought we were crazy too. Who leaves the city to live in the wilderness, they said. But we had our reasons, and we survived. You will too." She took Maggie's hand. "Now tell me what I can do to help." Helen could not carry stones or build walls, but she could watch the children while Maggie worked. She could bring food so Maggie did not have to spend precious time cooking. She could keep the secret, deflecting questions from curious neighbors. With Helen's help, Maggie gained 2 extra hours of work each day. She used them to refine her creation, to seal gaps, to add a small storage alcove for firewood, to carve a drainage channel in the floor to prevent moisture buildup during spring thaw. One night after Emma had fallen asleep and Maggie was preparing for bed, Billy spoke from the darkness. "Mama, I know what you are building." Maggie froze. "You do? I followed you one day. I am sorry. But I was worried about you. You were going off alone all the time." Maggie went to sit beside her son. "You do not need to apologize. I should have told you. It is a room in the cave, is it not, for when it gets too cold? You call it the winter room." "Yes, that is exactly what it is." Billy was silent for a moment. Then he asked a question Maggie had not expected. "Did Papa know about the cave?" Before he went away, the words hit Maggie like a physical blow. She had avoided talking about Robert with the children. It was too painful, too complicated. But Billy deserved the truth. "Your father found the cave," she said carefully. "He went inside many times. He measured things, wrote notes. He wanted to use it to protect us." She retrieved Robert's notebook from beneath her pillow, the place where she kept it every night, and gave it to Billy. "These are your father's notes." He did not finish his idea, but he started it. Billy held the notebook as though it were sacred. He opened it, looked at his father's messy handwriting, and for the first time since Robert disappeared, he cried. Not the silent tears he had been hiding in all these months. Real crying, deep sobs from a boy who was finally allowing himself to grieve. Maggie held him and cried with him. "We will finish it," Billy said when his sobs subsided. For Papa, and for you, and for Emma." December 20th arrived with an ominous change in the air. The barometric pressure dropped. Maggie felt it in her ears and her bones. The sky turned the color of lead, heavy and threatening, like a blanket pressing down on the valley. Birds disappeared. The usual sounds of wildlife went silent. At the trading post, the oldest residents gathered with grave faces. "It is coming," Old Man Henderson said, his voice rough. "I can feel it in my bones, the big one. Worst in 20 years. Maggie looked at the sky as she left the trading post. The wind had begun to blow, not the usual gusty wind that came and went, but a steady, relentless current from the north cutting across the valley like a blade. How much time did she have? One day, too. She ran home, checked the supplies in the cave one final time, and gave Billy his instructions again. "If I tell you to go to the winter room, you take your sister and go. No questions, no waiting. Understood?" Billy nodded, his 8-year-old face wearing the serious expression of someone much older. "I understand." That night, Maggie did not sleep. She sat by the window watching the black sky, listening to the wind grow stronger with each passing hour. The storm was coming. December 23rd dawned without dawn. Maggie woke from a restless doze beside the window and realized immediately that something was wrong. There was no light. At this hour, the first gray glow of morning should have been visible through the glass, but outside there was only darkness. Then she heard it, the wind. Not the sound of wind blowing through trees, but a roar, a howl, a scream like some enormous beast trying to tear the world apart. She went to the door and tried to open it. It would not move. Snow had piled against it during the night, pressing the door shut. Inside the cabin, the temperature had dropped to 40 degrees despite the coals still glowing in the fireplace. Maggie added wood, built up the flames, but the heat spread only a few feet before the cold swallowed it. Billy woke and began coughing. The worst coughing fit she had heard yet, wet and rattling and frightening. Emma woke crying, her lips tinged with blue. Maggie checked the wood pile inside the cabin. Enough for one day, maybe two if she rationed carefully. She looked through a gap in the frost-covered window. Snow was falling sideways, nearly horizontal, driven by wind that seemed determined to bury the world. She could see nothing but white chaos. She had to decide. Now, get dressed, she ordered. All your warmest clothes, everything. Billy looked up, understanding immediately. The winter room, yes, now. She dressed Emma in 2 layers of shirts, wrapped scarves around the girl's head and neck. She checked Billy's boots, added extra socks. She pulled on her own heaviest coat. She dug a path through the snow piled against the door. It took 10 minutes of desperate shoveling before she could force it open. The wind hit her face like 1,000 tiny knives. Hold my hand, she shouted over the roar. Do not let go. The distance from the cabin to the cave was 70 yards. On a normal day, a 1-minute walk. That night in the blizzard, it felt like crossing a frozen hell. Maggie carried Emma against her chest, one arm wrapped tight around the girl's small body. Her other hand gripped Billy's with desperate strength. She could see nothing. Not the ground beneath her feet, not the hillside ahead, not even her own son beside her. Only darkness and snow and wind. 10 steps. The wind shoved her sideways. She leaned into it and kept moving. 20 steps. Emma sobbed against her chest, but the sound was swallowed by the storm. 30 steps. Billy stumbled and fell. Maggie hauled him up. Keep moving. Do not stop. 40 steps. 50 steps. Maggie began to doubt herself. Was she going the right direction? In the darkness and the blinding snow, she could not be certain. 60 steps. She felt the ground begin to slope upward. The hillside. 70 steps. Her hand touched stone. Cold limestone. The cave entrance. Inside, she gasped, pushing Billy through the narrow opening. The change was immediate and overwhelming. No wind, no snow, no screaming storm, just silence. Stillness. The quiet protection of stone. Emma stopped crying. Billy stopped shivering. They stood in the darkness of the cave, breathing hard, alive. Maggie lit the oil lamp. Warm light filled the space, illuminating the familiar walls, the sleeping platform, the firebox waiting to be used. We are safe, she said, her voice trembling. We are safe now. She built a fire in the firebox, small dry sticks kindling a single match. The flames caught, grew, spread warmth into the surrounding stone. Within an hour, the sleeping platform began to warm. Heat from the firebox rose into the stone mass, spreading through the sandstone slabs, radiating outward. Billy stopped shivering. His breathing grew easier, the coughing subsided. The warm, stable air of the cave was gentler on his weak lungs than the drafty cold of the cabin had ever been. Emma fell asleep, curled on the platform, her face finally relaxed, one arm wrapped around her doll Daisy. Maggie added one more small log to the fire, then let it burn down to coals. She did not need a roaring blaze. She needed steady heat absorbed into stone. Outside, the blizzard raged. Wind screamed across the valley. Snow buried everything in its path. Temperatures plunged to 20 degrees below zero. Inside the cave, the temperature held at 58 degrees. Maggie did not sleep that first night. She sat watching the fire die, watching the stone continue to radiate heat, watching her children sleep peacefully for the first time in months. The pattern held through the night. Hour after hour, the stone continued its slow release of stored heat, defying the frozen chaos outside. 6 hours after the last flame went out, when the faint gray light of dawn finally penetrated the storm enough to reach the cave entrance, Maggie checked the thermometer. 52 degrees inside. The platform was still warm beneath her hand. Outside, the temperature was 20 below zero, 90 degrees of difference, and she had used only 4 small pieces of firewood. The second day of the storm was worse than the first. Wind speeds that Maggie could only estimate from the sound must have exceeded 50 miles per hour. The snow fell so thick and fast that venturing outside was impossible. She could not even see the cave entrance from the sleeping platform. Inside the winter room, she maintained her heating cycle. 3 hours of fire, 6 hours of rest. Each cycle consumed about 6 small pieces of wood. Total firewood used on day 2, 11 pieces. The temperature in the cave never dropped below 56 degrees. The platform remained warm enough to sleep on comfortably. The children played, ate bread and dried meat, told stories to pass the time. Billy did not cough once. On the third day, December 26th, the storm finally began to ease. The wind still blew, but without its earlier fury. The snow still fell, but no longer as a blinding wall. Maggie decided to venture outside. She told Billy to watch his sister, then squeezed through the cave entrance into a world transformed. Snow had drifted to heights of 10 feet in places. The cabin was nearly invisible, just a portion of the roof showing above the white sea. She was making her way back to the cave when she heard a voice calling. "Mrs. Thornton, Mrs. Thornton." Marcus Fletcher, struggling through waist-deep snow, was coming toward her. "You were in there the whole storm?" he asked, breathing hard, his face red with cold. "Yes, the children too. In the cave. Safe. Warm." Marcus stared at the cave entrance as though it were a door to another world. "May I see?" Maggie nodded and led him inside. Marcus Fletcher had been building homes for 30 years. He took pride in his skills, his knowledge, his experience. And now he stood in a cave looking at a heating system he had never imagined, feeling warmth radiating from stone, with no fire burning, and he felt like a first-year apprentice. The air was warm. Not hot, not stuffy, just warm, comfortable, pleasant. He placed his hand on the sleeping platform. Warm, clearly warm. "How long since you had a fire going?" he asked, his voice hoarse. "This morning, about 6 hours ago. 6 hours. He touched the stone again, unable to believe what his hand was telling him. "What is the temperature in here?" Maggie showed him the thermometer. 62 degrees. Marcus knew the temperature outside. He had checked at the trading post that morning. 28 below zero, a difference of 90 degrees. With less firewood than most families burned in 3 hours just trying to keep their cabins above freezing. Marcus Fletcher stood in that cave looking at the woman he had dismissed as crazy, looking at her children playing healthy and warm on the stone platform, and he said something he had never expected to say. "I was wrong. Stone is cold. That is what I always believed. My father taught me that. His father taught him. 3 generations of builders, and none of us ever thought of this. Stone is not cold or hot," Maggie said gently. "Stone holds whatever temperature surrounds it, but it changes slowly, much slower than air or wood. If you heat it, it stays warm. If you leave it in the cold, it stays cold. The key is that it changes slowly. Your father taught you this, yes?" Marcus nodded slowly. "I would like to apologize for what I said, for what I thought. You came out in this storm to check if I was alive. That matters more than words." Marcus looked around the cave again, his builder's eye now analyzing rather than judging. That baffle wall by the entrance, to keep cold air from flooding in. Yes, cold air is heavier. It sinks and flows like water. The wall traps it near the entrance, and the firebox under the platform. To heat the stone from below, yes. Heat rises, spreads into the stone, mass radiates out slowly for hours. Marcus shook his head, a sad smile on his face. 30 years. I have been building houses for 30 years, and a woman with 2 small children figured out something I never even considered. I did not invent anything. The Russians, the Finns, the Chinese, they have been using these principles for hundreds of years. I just applied them, but you did apply them. You made it work. In these conditions with what you had. Marcus looked directly into Maggie's eyes. That is real ingenuity. He stayed for another hour asking questions, examining every detail of the construction. When he finally left, fighting his way back through the snow toward the settlement, his mind was churning with new ideas. He had come to check on a crazy widow. He had found something that would change how he thought about building for the rest of his life. The storm ended on December 27th, but winter had only begun to show its true face. When the clouds finally parted and the sun appeared for the first time in 4 days, the Bitterroot Valley lay buried beneath a sea of white. Drifts rose 10 feet high where the wind had piled them. The trading post recorded a temperature of 30 degrees below zero. Families across the settlement dug tunnels through the snow just to reach their outhouses and woodpiles. The assessment of damage began immediately. The Patterson family had lost 2 cows frozen in their barn, and their youngest son had developed a rattling cough that would not clear. The Henderson family's roof had partially collapsed under the weight of accumulated snow, and old man Henderson himself had injured his shoulder trying to shore it up. The Miller family had burned through their entire wood supply before the storm ended and had resorted to breaking apart furniture just to keep from freezing. 3 children across the valley were seriously ill with cold-related ailments. Dr. Harrison Wells moved from house to house through the snow, his medical bag clutched against his chest, his face growing grimmer with each visit. And the Thornton family. The Thornton family was fine, not just surviving, fine, healthy, warm, well-fed. When this news spread through the settlement, people did not know what to make of it. The widow with the crazy cave project, the woman everyone had pitied and mocked, had somehow weathered the worst blizzard in 20 years better than families with proper homes and experienced men to provide for them. That evening, Marcus Fletcher stood in the trading post and told everyone what he had witnessed inside Maggie's cave. 62 degrees, he said, his voice still carrying a note of disbelief. 62 degrees inside that cave while it was 28 below zero outside. A difference of 90 degrees, and she used 11 pieces of firewood in 3 days. 11 small pieces. I burned more than that in 3 hours trying to keep my house warm. The room fell silent. Marcus Fletcher was not a man given to exaggeration. When he stated a number, that number was accurate. "How is that possible?" someone asked. "Stone holds heat." Marcus shook his head slowly as he spoke, as though still trying to convince himself. "She built a platform out of stone, built a firebox underneath it. The fire heats the stone, and when the fire goes out, the stone keeps radiating heat for hours. The cave itself acts as insulation. Thousands of tons of rock and earth surrounding that space, keeping the temperature stable. But stone is cold," another man objected. "Everyone knows that. Stone is not cold or hot." The voice came from the corner of the room where Thomas Garrett sat alone with his drink. "Stone holds whatever temperature it absorbs, but it changes slowly, much more slowly than air or wood. Heat it up and it stays warm. Leave it in the cold and it stays cold. That is basic physics." Thomas paused and looked around at the assembled faces. "I have seen similar systems in Pennsylvania. The old German settlers built what they call Kachelöfen tile stoves with massive masonry cores. Same principle. Heat the mass, let it radiate slowly. But I never thought to apply it to a cave, Mrs. Thornton figured out something none of us considered. The mood in the trading post shifted. What had been dismissed as madness was now being discussed as innovation. What had been pitied was now being examined with genuine curiosity. Over the following days, a steady stream of visitors climbed the hillside to see Maggie's winter room for themselves. She welcomed them all, explained everything, answered every question with patience and clarity. She did not boast or lecture. She simply described what she had built and why. "Every cave is different," she told each group. "Every cellar, every dugout, every space has its own characteristics. You cannot simply copy what I built. You must understand the principles first, then adapt them to your specific situation." Among the visitors was a man whose opinion carried particular weight. Jacob Whitmore was 50 years old, the best stonemason in the region. He had built more than half the chimneys and fireplaces in the valley, and he understood stone the way a musician understood instruments. Jacob spent 2 hours in the cave examining every detail. He ran his hands over the walls, tested the joints in the baffle wall, studied the angles of the firebox. He said almost nothing during his inspection. Finally, he stood before the sleeping platform and placed both palms flat against its surface. "Clean work," he said at last. "Very clean. Friction fit with no mortar, but no gaps either. You taught yourself this. My father taught me the theory. The practice I figured out on my own." "Who was your father?" "William Hartley. He was an engineering professor at MIT. Jacob's eyes widened slightly. "Hartley. I read a paper of his once years ago when I was still an apprentice in Philadelphia, about the thermal properties of natural materials. He never published formally. That paper must have been a draft that someone shared, but his ideas." Jacob looked around the cave again. "His ideas are being proven right. Here, in this limestone cave in Montana. Maggie said nothing, but she felt something warm bloom in her chest. Her father had died when she was 17, his work unfinished and unrecognized. He had never seen his theories put into practice. He had never known that his daughter would one day use his knowledge to save her children's lives. But somehow, standing in this cave she had built with her own hands, she felt his presence, his approval, his pride. The winter of 1887 was not as severe as the previous year, but it was cold enough to test the new systems that had begun to appear across the valley. Richard Palmer, who owned a homestead 5 miles south, had a root cellar dug into a hillside. After visiting Maggie's cave, he recognized its potential. Within a month, he had converted it into a winter shelter with a stone sleeping platform and a masonry firebox. The walls of his cellar were thicker than Maggie's cave, and the system worked even better than the original. The Henderson family, despite having no cave or cellar, dug a room into a hillside behind their property. 3 walls of stacked stone, a roof of logs covered with sod, a masonry heater at the center. It was not elegant, but it was warm. Thomas Garrett built something different on his own property. He called it a Montana Cachalofen, a massive stove of stacked sandstone with channels for smoke to pass through before escaping up the chimney. The stone absorbed heat while the fire burned and released it slowly through the night. Jacob Whitmore began receiving requests. Can you build me a heating platform like Mrs. Thornton's? Can you design a firebox like hers? Can you teach me how the ventilation works? He took the jobs, but he always sent his customers to Maggie first. Go see the original, he would say. Understand why it works before you try to copy it. By spring of 1887, 6 families within 50 miles had built some version of Maggie's thermal mass heating system. By the following winter, that number had doubled. The technique spread not through formal instruction, but through demonstration, conversation, and the simple human desire to survive more comfortably. Thomas Garrett continued his quiet courtship of Maggie through 1887 and into 1888. He never rushed, he never pressured, he simply appeared at the Thornton homestead with useful gifts and practical help. Venison from his hunting trips, repairs to fences and tools, bundles of dry kindling left by the woodpile without comment or expectation of thanks. He told Maggie about his late wife Martha one summer evening as they sat on the cabin porch watching the children play. Martha had fought tuberculosis for 5 years before finally succumbing. Thomas had stayed by her side through every day of her illness, and when she died, he had felt his own life ending with her. His 3 children were grown and married, living their own lives back in Pennsylvania. The farm there held too many memories. He had come to Montana hoping to escape, or perhaps hoping to find a reason to keep living. I was not looking for anything when I came here, he told Maggie. I just wanted to be somewhere different, somewhere that did not remind me of everything I had lost. Maggie understood. She had felt the same way when she fled Boston with Roberts all those years ago. Their relationship developed slowly, built on mutual respect rather than passion, on shared practicality rather than romantic gestures. They were both people who had lost spouses, who knew the weight of grief, who had learned that survival sometimes mattered more than happiness. Billy liked Thomas. The man taught him to track animals, to read weather signs in the clouds, to judge distance and direction in unfamiliar terrain. These were skills Robert had never possessed, practical knowledge that would serve Billy throughout his life. Emma adored Thomas. She called him Mr. Bear because of his gray beard and his deep voice, and she insisted on introducing her doll Daisy to him with great ceremony. This is Daisy. Papa made her for me. Now you are my new papa, so you have to like Daisy. Thomas had knelt down, looked at the worn rag doll with complete seriousness, and said, Daisy, it is an honor to meet you. I promise to take good care of Emma. Emma had been satisfied. In spring of 1888, nearly a year and a half after the Great Blizzard, Thomas came to Maggie's cabin on a Sunday afternoon. He carried a small wooden box he had made himself. Maggie, he said without preamble, I know you do not need a man. You have proven you can do everything yourself. But I want to ask you something. Would you like a companion? Someone to share the work and share the life and share the winters? He opened the box. Inside was a simple silver ring with oak leaves carved around its band. I am not wealthy, I am not young, but I can promise you one thing: I will respect you. Not because you are my wife, but because you are Maggie Thornton. Maggie looked at the ring, then at Thomas, then toward the yard where Billy and Emma were playing with Helen Morrison's dog. She thought about Robert, the man she had loved, the man who had given her two wonderful children, the man who had vanished into the mountains and never returned. She could not replace Robert, but she could move forward. "I accept," she said. The wedding took place in June at the small wooden church. The entire settlement attended. Helen Morrison wept with joy. Marcus Fletcher shook Thomas's hand and told him he was a lucky man. Jacob Whitmore gave them a wedding gift. He had made himself a small stone shelf carved with geometric patterns. Billy stood beside his mother with the serious expression of someone much older than his 9 years. When Thomas had asked his opinion before proposing, Billy had considered the question carefully before answering. "You are a good man, and Mother needs someone to help carry the stones." Thomas had laughed for the first time since arriving in the Bitterroot Valley. Emma served as flower girl, scattering petals down the aisle and grinning throughout the ceremony. Before the service, she had formally introduced Daisy to the Reverend and explained that her old papa had made Daisy, but her new papa was going to take care of everyone now. The years that followed were good ones. Thomas moved into the Thornton cabin, and together they expanded and improved it. Marcus Fletcher himself helped with the renovation, working alongside Thomas for 3 weeks to reinforce the walls, add proper insulation, and rebuild the fireplace, according to Jacob Whitmore's new masonry heater design. The cave remained. Maggie maintained it every summer, repairing small damage, improving the ventilation, keeping it stocked and ready. It became part of the family's identity, a backup shelter, a storage space, and most importantly, a reminder of what had happened during the winter of 1886. Billy grew into a quiet, capable young man. He apprenticed with Jacob Whitmore and learned the stonemason's trade, specializing in thermal mass heating systems. By the time he was 20, he was receiving commissions from across Montana and into Wyoming and Idaho. "You have your mother's mind," Jacob told him once. "You do not just build, you understand why things work." Billy married Sarah Henderson at 23. She was the daughter of Old Man Henderson, the same girl who had nearly died of pneumonia during the Great Blizzard. They had 4 children together, all raised in a house with a masonry heater that Billy had built with his own hands. Emma grew into a warm and cheerful woman, carrying her optimism from childhood into adulthood. She married the eldest son of Richard Palmer and had 3 children of her own. She kept Daisy her entire life, placing the worn doll on a shelf in her bedroom where her own daughters could see it. When her children asked about Daisy, Emma told them the story. Their grandfather Robert had made the doll before he disappeared into the mountains. The doll had been with her in the cave during the Great Blizzard, had kept her company during those 3 days when the world outside was trying to freeze everything solid. "Your great-grandmother saved us," Emma would say. "She built a room inside a cave because she knew things that other people had forgotten. And because she loved us enough to do impossible things." Maggie Thornton Garrett died in autumn of 1903. She was 49 years old. She passed in her sleep peacefully in the warm house that she and Thomas had built together. Thomas, now 60 years old and growing frail himself, sat beside her bed through her final night, holding her hand as the hours passed. When the first light of dawn came through the window, he whispered, "Thank you for 15 years, for everything." The entire valley came to the funeral. Many of those present had known Maggie since before the blizzard, had watched her transform from the strange widow digging in a cave to the woman whose knowledge had changed how the settlement survived winter. Reverend Thomas Whitfield, old now but still serving, delivered the eulogy. Margaret Thornton Garrett did not set out to change the world. She only wanted to keep her children alive through a Montana winter. But by paying attention to what others overlooked, by trusting what she knew. Even when everyone said she was wrong, she created something that outlasted her. She did not just save her own family. She taught this entire valley how to survive. And that is a legacy that will continue long after all of us are gone. Billy stood at his mother's grave, 30 years old now, with a wife and 4 children of his own. He looked down at the fresh earth and remembered the night of the blizzard when his mother had carried Emma through the screaming wind, when he had clutched her hand and refused to let go, when they had stumbled into the cave and found warmth waiting for them. "I will not forget," he whispered. "I will tell your story to my children, and they will tell their children, so that you will never be forgotten." The year was 1952, and Catherine Thornton closed the leather journal she had been reading. She stood at the mouth of the cave, 66 years after her great-grandmother had built it. The structure had partially collapsed over the decades. Weather and time had taken their toll, but the bones of Maggie's creation were still visible. The sleeping platform remained its stones, now covered with moss and debris. The curved baffle wall had crumbled, but its shape could still be traced in the fallen rocks. The firebox was filled with dirt and leaves, but its careful construction was evident to anyone who looked closely. The ventilation channel in the ceiling still led upward to the surface. Catherine had spent 3 months researching her great-grandmother's story. She had interviewed elderly residents who remembered Maggie, collected oral histories, measured and photographed the original structure. Her report for the local heritage project was nearly complete. "Great-grandmother," she said to the empty air, "I have told your story. In my history report, in my lectures to students and conversations with everyone who would listen." She paused, looking around the dim interior of the cave. "But I think you did not care about being remembered. You only cared about your children surviving." Catherine placed her hand on the sleeping platform. The stone was cold now, had been cold for decades. But she knew it could be warm again if someone built a fire in the firebox below. The physics had not changed. Stone still held heat, caves still insulated, fire still warmed mass. The principles her great-grandmother had understood in 1886 remained true in 1952 and would remain true forever. "And we are alive," Catherine continued. "4 generations, more than 50 people. All of us exist because one night in 1886 you carried your daughter through a blizzard to a room you built with your own hands." She opened the journal one final time and read the last entry Maggie had written. "December 27th, 1886. The storm has ended. We survived. Billy's cough is better. Emma slept through the night without waking. The stone platform is still warm, even though I let the fire die 6 hours ago. I do not know if I did everything correctly. I do not know if a real engineer would approve of my construction. But I know this. My children are alive. And right now, that is all that matters." Catherine closed the journal and held it against her chest. "You did everything correctly," she whispered. "You saved us all." She turned and walked down the hillside back toward the family homestead. Behind her, the cave stood silent and waiting, just as it had waited for 66 years. Stone was patient. Stone endured. And sometimes in the hands of someone who understood its nature, stone could perform miracles. The story of Maggie Thornton was not about caves or fire or physics. It was about a mother who refused to let her children die. It was about knowledge passed from one generation to the next. It was about the courage to do what needed to be done, even when everyone else said it was impossible. And it was about legacy, the things we leave behind, the lessons we teach, the lives we save that go on to save other lives in turn. Maggie Thornton had built a room inside a cave because she needed her children to survive the winter. She did not expect recognition. She did not seek fame. She just paid attention to stone and fire and air. And in doing so, she created something that lasted long after the blizzard melted and the critics fell silent. Something that would continue as long as there were people who remembered her story and understood its meaning. The physics had not changed in 66 years. Stone still held heat, caves still insulated, and mothers still did impossible things to protect the ones they loved. That was the lesson, not that caves were better than cabins, not that old methods were superior to new ones, but that wisdom came from understanding principles rather than blindly following traditions. From observing how heat moved, how materials behaved, how environments functioned. From having the courage to trust your own knowledge even when the whole world called you crazy. Maggie Thornton had understood that. Her children had learned it. Her grandchildren had inherited it. And now, 66 years later, her great-granddaughter was carrying the story forward. Because some things were too important to forget. And some people were too extraordinary to let fade into silence. The cave would endure. The story would endure. And the love that had built them both would endure longest of all.